I'm a ASEX certified sex therapist, and I'm a sexologist and a couples counselor, and I've been a sex researcher and a sex educator too, because I was a professor at 3 universities teaching in this area before. I'm nationally known for what I do. I'm the one who coined the term sex positive in 1976. And
Wow, that's actually really impressive.
yeah, yeah. And I started National Orgasm Week back about 1980 for college students. And I have buttons that say I came for National Orgasm Week. And I've just been kind of a pioneer, I guess you would say, in my field. Um, I I have a full practice. I work full time in 2 offices in Seattle and across the Bay and Paulsville, and that's where I am now. I'm a dock at a marina, and I've written a lot. I have a couple books at Amazon. One is a humor book, Sex from Out of Zipper with cartoons, and the other one is a book for teenagers called The Naked Truth About Sex. And so that's just kind of a thumbnail sketch of what I do.
Well, that's really impressive. It sounds like you really discovered a long time ago that, our sexuality is really an imperative part of our whole human developmental process. And
Yes.
and it sounds like you've really dedicated yourself to teaching that and helping couples or people heal. Why why is our sexuality so important? Why isn't it okay for us to just ignore it and stuff it down like society would seem to prefer we do?
Well, because no matter what culture you come from, sexuality is a part of yourself. It's not just having intercourse or something. It's just a part of expressing intimacy and pleasure, including to yourself through self-pleasuring. And so sexuality is a very integral part of the human condition. And of course, politicians are often trying to deny that, but there's no way they can.
What are some of the benefits of exploring our sexuality?
Well, the benefits are it makes us happy and normal mentally and physically. I mean, orgasm is a very important component of being human. And so is just the connection involved with being intimate with others. And so sexuality is just an integral part of ourselves. That's why you can't talk about such a thing as sex addiction or porn addiction, because sex is part of us and you can't be addicted to some part of you like you can to a drug or alcohol or whatever.
That is what I have heard, is that we actually we're not truly addicted to hormones that we're and chemicals that we're making.
No, no, we're not. Some people are obsessive compulsive about sex, but it's not addiction.
So how many years roughly have you been in this field?
Well, I've been in this field, oh, geez, it really dates me, almost 60 years.
Incredible. Incredible. You're truly, like you mentioned earlier, one of the pioneers. We've all,
Yes,
especially in recent times, heard that phrase, sex positive. You'll
yeah,
probably hear it in this interview. But
right.
I'm curious, in those 60 years, what are some of the repeating or recurrent issues that you've seen from people or clients in regards to their sexuality?
Well, I've seen it all really. I've seen, people who are uptight because they had a rigid religious background, and rigid religion is the arch enemy of sex, which is what I said in my TED talk about the 3 sexual revolutions. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that we just meet lots of resistance because people in control don't want you to enjoy pleasure, whether it be marijuana and getting high or whether it be having orgasm. And so they
Why?
try to control it all
Why don't they want us to experience pleasure?
because they're afraid somehow then that we won't have an orderly society and that people won't work and all they'll do is have sex, which of course is ludicrous.
Right, because while sex is one of our needs, it's not the only one.
Oh no, it's not the only one, but it is one of the primal needs we have is to have pleasure and to have connection.
Well, speaking of both pleasure and connection, we are from Live Jasmine, which is a campsite.
Yeah,
And we have, I mean, I'm sure you're well aware that the camming industry, the adult entertainment industry, it's very profitable. And
yeah,
I think that many people think it's only profitable because it's sexuality. But what we have realized is that many of our members, they pick specific models that they stay with. And we found that most of the calls that happen are conversations about day-to-day life. It's actually not all explicit. So
yeah. I understand that. Part of it's some of it's explicit.
some of it is explicit and some of it is just what the dog had for dinner. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
but I don't think there's anything wrong with being explicit. I mean, I think we ought to be explicit.
What are some of the benefits of being explicit?
Well, certainly it's more of a turn on. We get more aroused when there's an explicit approach to sex. Not to say just always full nudity, but lingerie or whatever, which leaves something to the imagination, which can be very. What I think is that fantasies are the final frontier of sex, and fantasies don't develop enough where people share them and act on them together. And so, with camming and with porn, you do have fantasies that you can relate to. My concern, though, is that some porn has gotten really, negative with the focus on incest and violence and that kind of thing, and it gives porn a bad name. You know what I'm saying? It's really, I mean, a lot of pornographers lack an imagination.
I want to go back to pleasure and connection.
Yes.
Is the drive for sexuality, is it ever completely separate from connection or the desire for connection?
Well, that's a good question. I suspect sometimes, unless you're ruling out connection with yourself, it's not always a connection with someone else. Sometimes it's a connection with yourself through masturbation, for example. And as Woody Allen once said, at least it's with somebody you love, hopefully,
Yeah.
you know. But connection is usually involved in some way. I mean, we live in a society where people are disconnected. What do? They go to work and they may have a family, but they're not necessarily strongly ensconced in their family in terms of their sex life in particular. And that's why I see a lot of people with sexual problems because, first of all, they didn't have enough sex education, and second, they just have so many other pressures in their life that they fail to develop a good sexual relationship.
And what are some of the consequences of not having a good sexual relationship or outlet?
Well, I think we live in a touch deprived society, and all touch is not foreplay, but we need more touch, the sensual part of it. And then, of course, the sexual touch is, I just think it's not well developed with great fantasies enough. Most people have pretty mundane sex lives. They do it the same way every time, the same time. It's more mechanical, and it's even not that good because they don't vary the mechanics even. You see what I mean?
Right. So, what are some pieces of advice that you would give to people to get out of that mundane rut?
I would say they need to, share and act on fantasies more than they are, and take more time for sex, and take weekends or vacations away, and to just focus on the pleasure and on orgasm and everything without interruptions from work or children or other extraneous influences.
So, it sounds like you really see the value in fantasy in particular.
Well, I do. I think fantasies are just the most underutilized part of sex, and some people get lazy. They just go to porn only for their fantasies instead of developing their own. And I think people need to develop their own fantasies too, because a lot of the pornographers lack a good sense of fantasy. They just don't. They don't have a good imagination. You know.
To your point, I do believe that a lot of the reason that um, many members come to Live Jasmine is to act out fantasies that they don't feel comfortable sharing with a spouse or a date or whatever the case is.
Yeah, I understand that. And so that's an opportunity to act out on fantasies and to understand fantasies more. And hopefully, as a result of camming, they take home some ideas they can, integrate in their own sex lives with their partners.
What are some of the benefits that you see in camming?
Well, I think one of the benefits is if people are lonely and they don't have anyone they're really relating to, it gives them a basis for at least talking about and noticing someone sexually, which could inspire them to do so in their real life too. I
Wow,
mean, it's not that camming should take the place of having a sex life of your own. It should enhance it.
right. Some members have strong disabilities and it's hard for them to leave their home. And
Yeah.
they are not able to have a normal social life, and they have found a way of getting some intimacy needs met through Live Jasmine.
Well, I agree that that's valuable. Sure. There's a place for camming. There's a place for having relationships that are sexual. There's a place for masturbation. It's just that we need to put more of a healthy lens on sexuality so we enjoy it and so we're sexual enthusiasts instead of, being labeled in some negative way.
I'm curious, have you yourself faced stigma or criticism in your career because it is
Oh,
focused on sexuality?
oh, of course I have. I mean, I was a professor at the University of Massachusetts, and they denied me tenure because they thought I was too liberal about sex, and they wouldn't quite admit it totally. But I took them to federal court, and I prevailed in a First Amendment suit, and it
Wow,
was in the national media, at the time.
wow.
I mean, I've been nationally visible. I've been on Oprah a couple of times. I've had my own radio show on a big rock station in Atlanta when I had a practice there. It was called the Pleasure Dome, and it was the number one show on Sunday nights in Atlanta for 3 years. And it was partly because of the humor. I'm into humor. I do some stand-up comedy, and most therapists are just almost humorless. They just don't have well-developed senses of humor, and I don't think they're as effective because of it.
I'm curious, you've had this incredible career. You're obviously passionate about what you do.
Yeah,
I think you have to be to stick with something for that.
right.
If
Yeah.
you could put into sentence, if it's even reducible to one sentence, if you could put into one sentence what summarizes your work and what you wish people knew.
Well, what summarizes my work is taking an evidence-based approach. In other words, I think we need research to know much about sexuality. You can't just go only on knee-jerk reactions and everything. And I think we need consistent sex education in the schools, which would be based on evidence instead of just somebody's bias, you know. We don't have enough sex research, and there's not enough funding for it. People like Justin Lehmiller are doing good work, but we need more Justin Lehmillers. You see what I mean?
We've interviewed him as well, yeah.
Yeah, no, he's a good one. And he has a book on fantasies and he's done good research.
What do you wish the world knew and accepted about sexuality?
That it's not something to be afraid of. It's not something that you have to fear because you think that some untoward consequence is going to happen just because you're normally sexual, or that others are going to admonish you. I think you have to have a thick skin and get beyond that. And just the best offense, I mean, the best defense is a good offense. And I think those in the sex field should not be shy about promoting pleasure. and about doing so enthusiastically instead of always defending their position about sex with politicians and deeply religious people who are basically not only humorless, but not healthy in their views of sex. I think we need another sexual revolution, and that's what I argued in my TED Talk, and it's on the bottom of my homepage at drrogerlibby.com. Um, I was one of the leaders of the second revolution, which was in the 60s and 70s. I was one of 4 people that really led the revolution. The first revolution was in the 1920s with the Flappers and the Bohemians. I missed that one. I wasn't alive for that. But I think we will have another revolution. I think that it's being put off by politicians, the economy, COVID, all the negative forces that have worked against it happening, but it will eventually occur.
And what do you think it will bring about, or what do you hope?
I think it'll bring about completely comprehensive evidence-based sex education in the schools, and it'll bring about getting rid of laws that infringe on our freedoms and only have laws that protect us to make our own choices. And I believe that it's going to really be an open approach where sexual pleasure and intimacy are just absolutely celebrated with a variety of public celebrations, which we already have some of, like Mardi Gras, et cetera, but not in a consistent way across our culture.
What do you think, if people do have this healthier education and we are more healthy sexually, what potential, just a guess, what potential changes might that lead to in society?
Well, I think it would lead to less divorce, and I think it would lead to ratifying relationships that are not marital to be sexual. Everybody doesn't have to get married. I think it would. I think it would really just provide more balance so that you have the time and energy and imagination to be fully sexual instead of just focus on work and wiping dirty noses with children or something, Most people get caught up with work so much that they don't enjoy sex. They don't enjoy pleasure. They don't have enough leisure time to enjoy it. I think we need to develop more leisure time. I think we need to make better choices so we're happier with our sexuality and so we truly enjoy it and look forward to expressing it.
You mentioned, I think the 2 key words that you've mentioned a few times are pleasure and connection. Those seem to be 2
Yeah.
areas that we overall as a society are lacking in. We don't really know how to enjoy pleasure or connect.
No, no. Well, today the focus is on mutual consent, and that's a fine thing. But very rarely do we talk about what we're consenting to. And one of the ideas I've had was that maybe we need a sexual credit bureau, just like you have a regular credit bureau. And you'd have a sexual credit rating, and you'd have an erotic resume with references from previous lovers and special skills like oral sex. And you'd sit down and have a pre-sex discussion and compare your resumes and decide whether it was a good idea to have sex or not.
Well, that kind of sounds like some of the structure of campsites, to be honest.
Yeah, well, maybe so. Yeah, that's probably true.
And that's probably what this industry does well, because men or members can know exactly what they're getting into. There's an agreed upon, do you do this? You don't do this. You're really great at this.
Yeah, you can kind of choose what you want to be exposed to, right?
Yes. You mentioned non-monogamy and the fact that not everyone has to conform to marriage and traditional relationships.
Yeah,
Curious,
yeah.
because we do live in a society that basically says, okay, well, if you're not just monogamous, then there's something wrong with you. Is there something wrong with people psychologically who don't want monogamy?
No, not all people can handle non-monogamy. They have to have a secure sense of self and a good relationship where the relationship is the primary source of pleasure and intimacy. But a lot of people do experiment with non-monogamy when they don't have those qualities, and then it doesn't work. But I work with lots of people who are swingers or have polyamory or open marriage, and it works for some people, but it doesn't work for all. But we don't live in a monogamous society. We just say we do. When you look at the amount of cheating, quote, and all this, it's not monogamous. And we're not naturally monogamous. We're naturally attracted to more than one person. It's just normal. I mean, not everybody's walking a telephone pole looking, but some people are, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's important to clear up because unfortunately, people who are wanting to explore their relationship structures beyond just the traditional monogamy, they also face a lot of stigma.
Oh, they do. They face it all the time. That's why they have to not be totally blatant about it with those who would disapprove that, because all they're going to get is criticism then, right?
What are 3 practical steps that a listener right now could take to exploring their sexuality in a healthy way?
Well, the first would be to have a healthy approach to masturbation. That's a basic building block for being sexual with anyone else, whether you're straight or gay or whatever. And the second would be to be fully informed about sexuality so you know how to relate to it and express it in a responsible way so that you're not just selfish, but that you're connecting with others. And the third would be to support financially research on sex and to support Planned Parenthood and to support the ACLU and any group that would work for our freedoms instead of against our freedoms.
You mentioned at the start of our call that you are the one who termed and coined the phrase
Sex
sex
positive.
positive,
Yes,
which is very popular right now.
it is. It's just that all people don't agree on what that means.
And
Can you,
that's exactly what I was going to ask you. When you
yeah,
coined that term, what was
yeah.
your meaning behind it?
Well, the meaning, and it was actually first used in a university textbook I co-authored with 2 other people, which is called Sexual Choices, because I think in order to be sex positive, you have to have choices that you make instead of being bamboozled into one way like monogamy or something for all people. But to me, it means having an honest, open, sensitive approach with equality between the partners and full accountability. In other words, not trying to pull one over on somebody else or anything, and not seeing sexual repression or guilt or shame as a good thing. Instead, it's a bad thing that blocks us from being fully intimate and human. It's a joyful thing. I think sex positive means you're joyful. I mean, our culture is still very sex negative in a lot of ways. I mean, you just mentioned pornography in a lot of sectors, and a conservative is just going to disapprove without even knowing that there's a variety of depictions of sex in pornography. It's not all the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And pornography, has become the major sex educator in our culture, not just for young people, for all people. And that's kind of dangerous because it's not always evidence based.
Right.
So I think people who work in the sex industry, sex workers, et cetera, have to have some education so that they're conveying accuracy rather than some kind of myth about sex.
Do you think that from what you've seen throughout the years, do you think that we're taking sexual health more seriously than years prior or less seriously than years prior?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's less seriously because look at the CDC. I mean, through the COVID and all that, they haven't done a very good job because they haven't had enough funding to do a good job with STDs or STIs as they call them now. And so, in that sense, and also sex education is under attack. We've gone backwards in many ways because of politicians and laws and rigid religion. Some people don't feel adequate to be a good lover because they haven't had much sex education and they came from families that didn't talk about it. And so they thought there was something wrong with it and they felt ashamed, or they were discovered masturbating by a parent or something and they were admonished for it. So all of that sex negative stuff is because parents themselves haven't had adequate education, so they don't know how to educate their kids. That's still a problem. It's a huge problem. School board meetings are just rife with sex negative people when you talk about sex education in the schools or whatever. I mean, we're allowing, minorities to control the majorities, like in education, and that's a really big mistake. We need to speak out more. We need to have some kind of guts. You know what I mean? Always have yourself first and love yourself first. Even tell yourself when you go to bed at night, I love you to yourself. I think that's very important.
I think that's very profound. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
I mean, the focus on the self has to be the first focus. If we don't have people with strong senses of self and strong self-esteem, then they're not going to have strong relationships either. And that's partly because they have sexual trauma or other trauma in their background. And in that case, they need a trauma therapist that does eye movement therapy to put it behind them. And I'm also concerned about some of the professionals in my field that are not qualified to do what they do. They're not certified as sex therapists. They call themselves sex coaches or whatever. They have no training. They're not competent to do what they're doing. And I think that's a danger. For example, people go to marriage counselors sometimes with sexual problems, and they're lucky if they had a course in sex. They don't necessarily know a lot about it, so they convey their own biases, and then I have to undo it all when they get to my door. You see what I mean? So even professionals aren't always insightful about this because they just don't have the background.
Correct.
No fab, that's another one where you're not supposed to masturbate in November or something. Well, I'm due back on planet Earth.
I have heard that masturbation is especially healthy for women's systems.
Well,
Um,
it is. It's healthy for both sexes because mentally and physically to have orgasm and to love yourself is a very important experience. I don't think a lot of people love themselves enough, and then they try to love others and they're not able to.
yeah.
Instead, they're critical of themselves. Like, oh, I'm not perfect. Well, nobody's perfect. Unfortunately, the rigid religions and politicians don't. And so you've got a war over the meaning of sex today. That's what it is.
This has been an incredible interview. I'm curious, is there anything about this industry, this field, sexuality, sexual health, anything that we haven't talked about, but that you want to share?
Um, well, we've talked about sex education in the schools, but I still think that is the basic thing that's missing. We have some of it, but not enough of it. And without education based on research, it's impossible to have a comprehensive, healthy approach to sexuality. We need more research because knowledge without, education without knowledge is impossible. We need good sex research and we need good sex education and we need good therapists who are well trained instead of half-baked people that call themselves therapists when they're not. I mean, there are people out there that call themselves sex therapists who are far from being sex therapists. It's really dishonest.
Well, I think you kind of answered it in the last one, but how do we create? And I ask every single expert I interview this question. How do we create a more sex positive, your
Uh-huh.
society?
Well, I think we do it by speaking out and not giving in to moralists, not giving in to those who are sex negative as if they have the high ground morally. They don't. They have the low ground and they just don't know it. And so you need to not only take care of yourself and your friends, but try to educate those who are sex negative so they realize the error of their ways. And you do that through the media, through social media, through just talking to friends and forming groups that would discuss sex in a healthy way. And I think public celebrations of pleasure are needed more. Like Key West has Fantasy Fest, and there are certain public celebrations, but not enough to really say sex is a good thing, and we're going to celebrate pleasure together collectively.
I love that. Public celebrations of pleasure.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for interviewing me.
Of course.